Bulgaria and within the Bulgarian Center Research Foundations, we have the intentions of achieving gender balance of the members and the experts working for the organizations. To Simplodiv, for instance, we are perfectly gender balanced. We have half women and half men being included in the work on the different projects we have. In Plodiv, we do not have a very active LGBT organizations, but our colleagues in Sofia are cooperating with the NGOs. Unfortunately, the patriarchal culture is silencing women in Bulgaria when it comes to violence against women. For instance, they still are afraid to speak of their status of domestic violence victims, especially in the rural communities, and even if they dare to come us to asking for advice, they do not continue seeking justice and do not go often to the police. Again, unfortunately, the representatives of the LGBT and the women with the disability are not very well placed in the social and feminist movements in Bulgaria. That is mostly true about LGBT. The women with disabilities starts having better presentation in the recent years, especially because the legal requirements of the European Union law. Thank you.
This is clearly the case. It happens. At the same time, the opposite also happens. I was, until last year, a member of the board of the Women's Environment and Development Organization based in New York, which is a women's organization created by Bella Abzug at the time of the Rio conference. And it used to be a women's only organization, but at some moment they decided, oh, we will invite a man like me to be part of the board. And it was a very interesting experience, but in a way, a board is a board, and we were discussing all the boring issues that a board discusses and some of the very interesting and exciting issues, and it was a comfortable position for everybody. Gender, as you know, and even the larger identity practices and policies permeates all cultures, and people's behavior are determined culturally. So some cultures do not allow boys and girls to mingle or do certain activities together and are separated until a certain age. And in many other places, you have race distinctions, and people identify and behave and group around skin color or language or racial identification or sexual preferences or caste, which is also a powerful divider or definer of identity in several cultures. This is rapidly changing as the societies urbanize, as the human rights permeate the cultures, and the notion that human rights are rights for each and everybody start to prevail over whatever identity you choose for yourself or you are assigned to by the system. So it happens also in movements, even in social justice movements, because they are inserted in a culture and in a society. So until very recently, union movement in my country, in Uruguay, the unions of teachers, for example, where the members were 95% women, but the leadership was 95% men. So, and the same would happen perhaps with the nurses, where again the membership is overwhelmingly majority women, but the leadership was majority or exclusively male till quite recently, because women were thought not to be capable to be in leadership position. This is changing. It is a cultural change. One of the things that we have learned is that culture and attitudes and so on do change, and that is why it is important to signal what kind of practices, no matter how much they could be culturally based, are now inappropriate and shouldn't happen anymore. And I think it's changing, and the movement is changing. If I can say something about the masculine feminist cultures operating in feminist and social justice movements, I think both the feminist movement and the social justice movement are very diverse, and there are different kinds of organizations and different attitudes in organizations. And that's part of the richness of the movement. And there is a heated debate, and I think it's a legitimate debate. And that debate has historically also happened between different kinds of movements. At the time of the fight against apartheid, you had movements like the African National Congress, which was a mixed race movement against racism and apartheid. But then many people started to feel, well, how come it is the white people that are speaking always on behalf of the movement when the majority is black? Mixed race means that the rank and file are the black people, but the leadership is white. Why is that happening? And movements were organized, for example, by Steve Biko and so on, that were black people only movements. In a sense, you can build analogies with and metaphors with some kind of growth metaphors and so on. At a certain stage, perhaps the isolating a certain group as only whatever defines your cause and your struggle can be helpful to reaffirm an identity, a feeling of self-confidence, and a feeling of ownership over the movement. And then in other moments, it's much more the attitude of, well, this is not just for us. And that's the old dilemma. So are we a women's movement only, or are we a gender movement, which also challenged men to change their attitudes? And if women change, shouldn't men change also, and accordingly, for their own benefit, not just because they are in solidarity with women? And of course, in that process, gender identity is not just black and white, it's not just men and women, it includes gay, trans, bi, and any other definition that you want to create. It's like the categorization of people in black and white. In a sense, it's not white, it's whatever, and it's not black, and what is seen as white in one place is not seen as white in another place. So it has nothing to do with the color. It's the culture, the identity, how you are identified, how you identify yourselves. And what you want to be also is, in a sense, important, as well as what you are allowed to be, and what limits, what rights, responsibilities comes with that. To make matters worse or more complicated, this is crossed by social issues and class issues. When we talk about women, or we talk about men, or we talk about trans, or we talk about, are we talking about rich poor, peasant, rural, indigenous. In Latin America, in many places, indigenous cultures do not have a dual gender identity. They have at least 3 recognized genders. And so how those things work are complex cultural traits, which then what works in one situation, when it is transplanted, what has its origins in a rural, indigenous, or whatever community, transplanted into an industrial, urban area, and so on, works in completely different ways and then creates all kinds of confusions. If you want to complicate matters even more, then you have identity politics and people building political power by overemphasizing the identity, be that around ethnic, nationalistic, language, or gender definitions or sexual preferences. Middle-class intellectual white women movement does not quite expresses the concerns and the interest of poor black domestic workers, which have their specific agendas and their specific needs and so on, and the differences in class, social status, and so on can be even bigger than the gender communality. Age can also play in that. So society is made of a great variety of conflicts and interactions that make about the diversity. Conflict is in many ways what pushes social progress and social evolution forward. We shouldn't by itself be afraid of conflict, but of course conflict doesn't mean violence, doesn't mean oppression and terrorism. It can mean quite the contrary. In my experience, in terms of direct experience in Latin America, but I hear this is happening in other places, transsexual identity is like really the ultimate bottom of the ladder, suffering all kinds of discrimination, oppression, prohibition from certain jobs. We have had cases of trans teachers that were allowed to study, that were allowed to get the teacher's degree and so on, but then were never allowed to teach and were never allowed into the classroom. So they ended up having bureaucratic jobs but not allowed in the classroom on any other grounds that they were trans. So yes, that is still like the ultimate barrier, and it's not just one case where it's quite exceptional that trans could actually study, get a teacher's degree and so on. In most cases, not even studying is possible, not even attending school is possible and so on, which is one of the reasons why prostitution ends up as the only alternative for social insertion, which is, again, the degree of violence and so on against trans people is a serious problem in many places.